Want an authoritative answer on the question, can we afford a new state? You've come to the right place. Welcome to Northern Vibe. Thanks very much for tuning in. If we've never met, I'm Matt Moloney, host and founder of Northern Vibe. Northern Vibe is where discussions are held with interesting, informed people to gain their perspective on a new state and on any other issues that attract our curiosity. We're about sharing stories. Now, please like and share this page. Ask questions, make comments. We're getting some great suggestions from listeners on the comments page, so please keep them coming. This includes suggestions for guests. I've actually had a number of people reach out to me for guests. And if you're interested in coming on Northern Vibe, contact me through the Facebook page. Every week, we do a mention in dispatches, and this week's mention in dispatches goes out to Australian Red Cross. They do some great work at the Cairns Wellbeing Centre, Pat Gosper Place. I've got lots of my mates from Cape York who come down and stay with them. They've got a website and they're always seeking volunteers, so hop on and have a look. Now, for this episode, I'm pretty excited. I've secured the time of highly experienced regional business economist, Bill Cummings. Bill was born and educated in Cairns and took an economics degree from the University of Queensland in 1961, with majors in economics, accounting, maths, statistics, statistical mathematics. I don't know when he slept. This was followed by 7 years experience in economic research in Canberra, as a research officer with the Department of Trade, and as a research officer at the Australian Chamber of Commerce. Bill returned to the North in '68, spent 5 years as manager of the Ingham District Research and Promotion Bureau, followed by 8 years as manager of the Far North Queensland Development Bureau and its sub-board for tourism and travel, which is now Tropical North Queensland. Also, in his spare time, he set up his own economic and marketing research business in 1981. So apart from carrying out a wide-ranging economic and market research, covering almost all aspects of the economy, especially in Australia's tropical northeast, he served on a number of boards and committees over the years, including deputy chairman for the North Australia Development Council and on the council of the James Cook University in Queensland. It's a rather impressive resume, if I do make the observation. Bill, thank you very much for taking the time.
Welcome, Matt.
Well, what we'll do is I'll get you to tell a little bit of something of yourself and your family and your professional background, just for our viewers who may not know who you are.
Matt, well, my family roots go right back to the beginnings of the Cairns Far North Queensland region. On both sides of the family. My wife's family goes back to the origins of Townsville. I've seen, and between myself and my grandparents, we've virtually seen the whole of the history of Far North Queensland come through over the years. So I've been very much steeped in the whole process of development of the North. And of course, after I finished school, I went down to university in Brisbane and then went through to Canberra. And that was very valuable to give me national insights and be involved with policy making with the Department of Trade in the tariff policy section, which was a big issue at that time. And then subsequently with the Australian Chamber of Commerce, that really got me over to do tariff board cases, but a wide range of comment and policy issues at a national level, particularly affecting business. And of course, that led to relationships or contacts with the commercial embassies in Canberra and the press gallery and the politicians and the public service and so forth. With that background, in 1968, I came back north and, as you've said, managed the development and tourism organisations and had a deep experience there with the development particularly of the Cairns Far North Queensland region, but also being exposed to what was happening across the rest of the North. And then in my own business, we've dabbled or done work in just about every industry group across the North and almost every region, up into Papua New Guinea, even to the Pacific, done some consulting work up there. I've seen a fair bit of the development of the North, particularly over the last 30, 40 years.
Wow. That is really, really interesting. And I'd like to make a quick observation. When I'm talking to people, everyone kind of says, well, you know, why are people so kind of obsessed with money and economics, and it's a detriment of people? And the argument I always use is this. Well, first, yes, economics is the study. Economics is fundamentally the study of human behavior, really, because that's what that's what economics is about. We measure it through money, and we measure it through wealth. We measure it through these things, but economies are made up of humans.
That's right.
It's fundamentally what it's about. So this strange idea that people have, and they talk about it all the time, going, well, people like you, Matt, that are kind of really concerned about wealth creation and economies, it's to the detriment of human beings. The direct opposite is true. For me, economics is actually tied up with morality. The more we can create wealth for people, the better we can make people's lives. The more we can empower them to do things for themselves, the better we're making things for them, and of course for the communities at large. So, you know, chaps like you who are working in the background, keeping the steam engine of our economy going, really are contributing quite a lot, and also your perspective is sincerely valued. So, you know, again, thank you very much for coming on.
Yes, Matt. Actually, one of the early lectures in economics tagged it as the study of how unlimited wants are met by limited means. There's that balance that people's desires and wants are always more than what can actually be delivered. And economics is the business of how we go about reaching that balance between the two. And although a lot of it is about money, it is really fundamentally about people and how they react and the choices they make on a day-to-day basis. And that's the fundamental of it. But one of the important things, particularly in regional economics, is that you're looking at a lot of geography, a lot of history, a lot of other disciplines. And of course, at the sides, you get into psychology because of that business of people, how they make their minds up and how they react. And actually, I had an engineer friend who couldn't understand why we couldn't plan the economy. You know, engineers are typically, you know, great planners of how to go about things. But I explained it to him in these terms. I said, as an engineer, if you nail something to a wall, it normally stays there. In economics, because people's attitudes and circumstances change over time, that will move around on the wall, and even occasionally the wall itself will move. So it's very, very difficult to plan. And of course, one of the fundamentals behind economics that came out of Adam Smith, the great Scottish originator of political economy, was the importance of letting people decide what they want to happen.
Oh,
so get into politics.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Obviously, it was called political economy to start with. And
absolutely.
Obviously, once you're in economics, there's a whole lot of political decisions dependent upon economic judgments.
Absolutely. And look, if we do have, that's raised a whole raft of questions about, you know, a magnificent discussion we could have around the morality of economics and the psychology of that. And God willing, at the end of it, at the end of the interview, if we have a little bit more time, we'll kind of run into that. But we are here for the new state. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Bill, is like, historically, why do you believe there hasn't been a new state in the North so far?
Well, to understand the situation, well, there's been two factors. basically. One's been economic and the other has been political. However, to understand the situation, you've got to appreciate that the North is tropical. It represented a great challenge to a new nation that, with most of its people and its technology derived from Northwestern Europe. And so there were great challenges there in the early days. Now, it was, of course, the British were very familiar with tropical areas previously. And it's significant that they started off at Botany Bay, Port Jackson area, rather than Cooktown, where Cook spent most of his time. And it was late being settled, and it went great guns for a while. And we had the pastoralists move into the area. We had the mining start very much straight away. And then you had the plantations and the agriculture start up, forestry, fisheries start up with the pearling, and it was going very well in the late 1800s. But a couple of things happened that deeply affected it, because there was always a question of right up until the 30s, there was learned articles about it being an experiment of white settlers in the tropics, whether Europeans could live and work hard in the tropics, and it being regarded as something of an experiment. And so it was against that background of uncertainty. Now, those two things that happened in the late 1990s, the pastoral industry got knocked back very, very badly. Of course, sheep, the great developers, merino sheep, did not prosper in the north. They're a Mediterranean animal. And of course, it was magnificent for southern Australia, because merino sheep turned the grass of the pastoral resources of the south into a commodity that could stand the long. It was a relatively high value commodity that could stand the long transport time back to Europe. Now, that didn't, the north did not have that, and wheat did not prosper in the north, which is tropical. But they moved into cattle, and in the 1990s, redwater fever, that was tick-borne, came in from Asia, and absolutely devastated the pastoral industry. In fact, it wasn't until the 1950s that some areas got back to the carrying rate that there was in the 1990s. And then Federation came along, and there was a major change occur to the growing sugar industry, the plantation industries, etc. And with the White Australia policy, the switch from a plantation system with indentured labour to a small farmer system under the protection and of an embargo on sugar imports. But the whole industry had to adjust to that. At that time, we did have a banana industry actually before Federation, shipping to the south, and we also had tea and coffee starting. However, protection wasn't extended to those industries, and they died. And but in the meantime, of course, the big industry was mining, and it continued basically in the first 10 years of the new century. The economy here was absolutely dominated by mining. Now, what happened, of course, is that the sugar industry was expanding slowly. There was also a marine frontier with the pearling industry at that stage, particularly in the Torres Strait. But what happened was that, of course, the First World War came along. As far as the new state goes, there was a very strong movement pre-Federation, and Queensland insisted that there was a provision there that would enable new states in Queensland. However, with those checks coming through, and with the First World War, And then after the First World War, in fact, the mining collapsed also. Now, sugar was coming through with additional sugar mills and that sort of thing. And then there was the Depression, and then there was the Second World War. Now, at the end of the Second World War, basically, when you looked at the economy of the area, it was dominated by sugar. Basically, Far North Queensland, it was basically a sugar economy with a bit of local agriculture on the tablelands and the start of a tobacco industry, but also a protected industry. However, at that stage, the mining industry had gone, and also the pearling industry had gone. And in the 1947 census, Cairns was 16,000, Townsville was 30-odd thousand, Rocky was 30-odd thousand, and Mackay was about 14,000, I think. And so it was quite small, the economy, and of course, against that background, that economic background, it was very difficult to see the establishment of a new state. But things changed in the 1960s. And in fact, in Townsville, of course, you had the army base and the university start up. But more broadly, there are a number of factors that have led to very major growth over the past 40, 50 years. And first of all, the mining came back. The early mining had been mainly high-value minerals, gold and copper and silver and tin and things like that, whereas it was the great sedimentary deposits in the north that had come through, and of course coal in central Queensland. But in this region up in the north, the bauxite and silica sand came through. Now, Mount Isa was a high-value mineral, but it didn't come in until the 1920s. And of course, it also boomed in that post-war period. So we had the mining come through. Fisheries came back with the prawning in the Gulf of Carpentaria, particularly, and on the east coast. And in agriculture, there were three major turnarounds. The first was in the pastoral industry, the introduction of Brahman cattle that were much more suited to the environment and not subject to things like ticks and so forth. And cattle numbers across the north have grown very, very strongly. And actually on a per acre basis or hectare basis, there are now more cattle in the north than there are in southern Australia. And the other big development, of course, was the mechanisation of sugar, the bulk sugar terminals and that sort of thing, which brought the cost down. I was in Canberra at the time when the sugar industry was complaining about Australia's, the Australian sugar industry was complaining about the cheap labour sugar of the rest of the world, and posing a problem for our industry. A couple of decades later, overseas sugar countries were complaining of Australia's cheap mechanised sugar because the mechanisation of it absolutely revolutionised things. And by the 1980s, in fact, we went on to a free world market. The sugar industry was one of those protected industries that did grow up over the years to become fully internationally viable. But the third major thing that has happened is that in the 1960s, there was a book written by a fellow, Bruce Davidson, called The Northern Myth, that damned any agricultural development, cropping development in the north. However, that's changed. And the big factor in it, of course, we could grow a whole lot of things more efficiently and cheaply in the north. But the big factor was transport costs. And as the Bruce Highway got sealed and semi-trailers came along, we suddenly turned around and we were able to grow bananas and other horticultural produce. Now the Cairns region is now the third largest fruit producing region in Australia. Now, that is a major, major change in the status of the North. So and then the other thing that came along, of course, we've had the brilliant tourism resources. People have been coming to see them right from year dot, with the coastal shipping, and then the railway, and then a family car, and finally aviation. And of course, tourism has come through magnificently. And in the Cairns region, of course, it's come through to exceed, the mining and the agriculture and the fisheries individually, not necessarily combined. So we've had this very major development, and sitting behind it have been a number of major factors. And one of those, of course, has been the growth of world markets, is reaching out for new produce and so forth. And of course, there's been a lot of that world growth in more recent decades has been in Northeast Asia. That's relatively close to us, and we've seen those impacts come through. But the second major factor was transport. And of course, I just outlined how the development of transport enabled all these horticultural industries to come through, but also bulk carriers enabled those mineral resources, bulk mineral resources to be developed. And jumbo jets enabled the tourism to be developed. Now, also in there is communications, and I should point out that transport development has got a negative side to it, because it also means that it's cheaper to get commodities into the north, and we've seen some of the loss of manufacturing and so forth, like breweries and brickworks. And now the third factor has been the development of technology suited to the north, and we saw this. We've seen this across a broad field, and it's not just been in the agricultural industries and export industries. It's also been in everyday living. The introduction of air conditioning has absolutely changed circumstances in the region and the livability of the region. When I first came back north out of Canberra, I was really surprised. I picked up pieces of paper and they were limp compared to the crinkly stuff that you had in Canberra. However, in air conditioning, it's a very different thing. But also in everyday living, these jet sprays to get rid of the mold and all that sort of thing. And in health, knocking over things like dengue fever and malaria. And so there's been a whole lot of technology that's been favourable to tropical areas. And finally, of course, your success breeds success. As the population builds up and so forth, you can afford to have a whole lot of new extra facilities. For instance, in Cairns, it's enabled us to go through to have a university campus with museums, art galleries, better sporting facilities, and a whole lot of things like that. So that really make it more livable and attractive to people. So we've had a big growth of industry and population in the region. Cairns has gone through from 16,000 to about 160,000 today. And in the process, past 7 other regional cities in Australia. And although it's led the growth, there's been strong growth in Townsville and Mackay, and not so much in Rocky. A lot of the growth there's been in Gladstone. So as far as the new state goes, it's a very different picture now to what it was, back when I first started my working career. And however, one of the factors that has during that period has come through has been the political structure. Actually, there was a new state movement in Townsville. Professor Roderick at JCU back in the early 70s was promoting it strongly, and the chap Frank Rossiter from the Burdekin. However, in the 1950s, there was a change from, there'd been a Labor government for 28 years, and the coalition came in, the Country Party Liberal coalition. But importantly, the The Country Party was which is now called the National Party, of course, was the dominant partner in it. And it was only the dominant partner because in Queensland, there would have been a similar mix to New South Wales and Victoria, but the big tropical underdeveloped annex of Queensland tended to have views similar to regional southern Queensland, and the North's position in that led to the Country Party being the dominant partner in the coalition. So for quite some time during that period, from the 50s through to when there was a change of government in the 90s, you had a government that was very, very conscious of the North and country needs, and very pro-development of things like mining and agriculture and so forth. Now, of course, there's been a change since then that progressively, of course, the Southeast Queensland, basically because regional Queensland has grown much faster than regional New South Wales, regional Victoria. It's grown faster than Tasmania and South Australia. Because of that, the southeast Brisbane and the southeast corner have grown faster than Sydney and Melbourne, and have come up. And so the balance within Queensland has changed. That area has grown faster than the north, and of course has got an increasing proportion of the politicians, the state representatives in that area. So there's there is a real question there of the balance within Queensland and policies, statewide policies, etc.
Wow, that you covered off on so many issues there, and that raised so many questions. And I'm going to make a couple of observations before I jump into the next question. That was a quite succinct overview of pretty much our foundation. Really, you're obviously quite correct when you have this personal knowledge of what's going on. But one of the things that struck me is first the interdependence of all these different economic industries. There's this idea that you can kind of isolate things, and quite clearly that's just not the case. Secondly, well, going back to that really quickly, you get an expansion in one area and you kind of get a bit of a contraction in other areas. And that includes with both, from what I was listening to there, that includes both in the private sector and of course the government. So, if you get the government expanding in one area, you get a little bit of you get a corresponding contraction. So that was a really, really deep and pretty, if I can say, pretty cool way of explaining things. The double-edged sword of transport. I've also lived disproportionately in regional Queensland, and like I used to live in Winton, and Winton just before I got there had a soft drink factory, and it had a brickworks. It had all these sorts of things, and it had a number of butcheries. So transport is a good thing, and allowing all these accessibilities, but there's always there's that payoff and there's that flip with that. The last observation I'll make is there really have been periods of diversity. So we kind of started off as a very broad, diverse economy. Then we kind of like moved into the area of sugar, which pretty much limited our diversity. And now we're moving back to another area of diversity. And of course, none of us really know what's going to happen with COVID, but that was really, really interesting. Just for our listeners, can I get you to just indicate, because there was a lot of information there, and it was put really well. Can we directly answer the question? If we drew a line, say a little bit south of Gladstone, can we support financially a new state?
That area down to Gladstone really includes, 4 major regions, and the Cairns-based region, and Townsville and Mackay, and that based on Rockhampton, Gladstone. And actually, if you have a look at it in terms of population now, many years ago, in my career, you had to add up those 4 regions, their population, before you could get to the size of Tasmania. Now that area is twice the size of Tasmania in population. Actually, Cairns and Townsville regions put together are more than Tasmania. So the other thing, of course, is that compared with the Northern Territory, that area is about 4 or 5 times the population. So there's about 1 million people compared to South Australia. That's I think South Australia is at 1.7 million, with a lot of it in Adelaide. And so we would come in population up towards South Australia and growing faster over a long-term trend. Of course, there's accelerations and decelerations. We're going through a relatively slower growth period at present. But when you compare it across the Commonwealth, in mining and mining royalties and revenue, etc., we would come in after second to Western Australia, ahead of Southeast Queensland or Southern Queensland, and New South Wales and Victoria and Tasmania and etc. In terms of agriculture, we would come in up around the same as Southern Queensland, and South Australia would be behind New South Wales and Victoria, and I think behind Western Australia, but well ahead. Actually, the Cairns region alone is in agriculture, particularly in cropping, is ahead of Tasmania. Now, when you look at tourism, international tourism, in international holiday tourism, as opposed to visiting friends and relatives, etc., the Cairns region alone is ahead of Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Northern Territory. So we would come in up towards Southern Queensland and in behind New South Wales. Actually, the Cairns region is in international holiday tourism right up there, just behind Melbourne. So, very strong in a number of those basic industries. Fisheries, we're well up there with it. Mining, well, that's right, I've said we're second. Actually, so the base is pretty strong. And when you look at the gross regional product, or gross domestic product, or gross state product, depending on the area you're talking about, we are up towards South Australia, but on a per capita basis above South Australia, and certainly well above Tasmania and Northern Territory. So we would come in there overall as strong as South Australia, basically. Even though South Australia's currently got more population, we're growing faster, and we've got more base industries. For instance, in export volumes, we'd leave all the other states for dead, mainly because of the mining. So we'd come in there very strongly. And so, there's a very strong base to the economy, very much export oriented, a strong base for that economy.
Well, that's a magnificent comparative breakdown as to where we go as a region and compared to other states. So you've actually kind of answered my follow-on question. I was going to ask, how would we compare with other regions, but you've clearly answered that. And also, from what I've gleaned to the direct comparisons you made, to really give a simple answer, yes, we can afford it.
Yes, and there are some issues that we've got to address. However, the basic strength of that economy is there, and to stand alone compared to the other states and territory. But of course, one of the major, there's a viability question, but there's also the question of the benefits. one of the problems we've got at present is sound policy making for the region, and there's a whole host of things where the interests of the North and its development and so forth don't necessarily coincide with the interest of the South, and particularly Brisbane and the southeast corner. And there's a whole range of them, you know, that are, and they crop up regularly in political discussion, and you know, simple things like crocodiles, and you know, however, things like we've got a growing agricultural sector. Basically, in southern Australia, it sort of slowed down. There was a lot of development of agriculture early on, a century ago, but we're still expanding in agriculture. And we've seen now Tinaroo Dam go through to be fully committed, and we need another dam in the region to continue the growth. And the North, because of its climatic conditions and so forth, and a wet and dry cycle and so forth, you know, water storage in tropical areas is very important to agricultural productivity, and we need dams, which have not been on the agenda very, very strongly, and the growth of agriculture. In tourism, we've been seeing complaints that that the region's tourism is not being promoted adequately as separate as you know, it's a separate product to southeast Queensland and southern Queensland, and so in a new state, there's a whole lot of these issues that, from a policy point of view, we're likely to get a policy direction much more attuned to our needs. Another one is just the whole business of relations with the Pacific and the near North. It's terribly important to us, and we've got these links up with Papua New Guinea and so forth, but at times we run across that really the strong links out of the South with shipping and things like that aren't necessarily leading to us prosecuting the opportunities in those areas.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's one of the major things, is you get a better policy making and for the North. And of course, the other benefits that at federal level, of course, and the Brisbane has raised this and so forth, that compared to, say, Tasmania, we're grossly underrepresented. I think we've got 3 senators, or 2 or 3. It's been variable in the northern regions. Tasmania's got 12. It had a guarantee under the Federation Agreement of 6 House of Representatives seats. I think we might have 5 for twice the population. The Northern Territory has got 2 senators for 1/4 of the population. So at federal level, and you know, representation and of our views and our special needs we're badly underrepresented in the Commonwealth Parliament.
Of course, and when you were discussing before the how the economy is, of course, related with policy decisions, and all of these things are deeply interrelated. It's a web, and we're going to be able to get more contracts here in North Queensland, more government-related contracts, if we get better Senate representation. I mean, we saw what happened with the whole, you know, submarine fiasco. If I can.
Yes, that's right. Well, actually, one of the very disappointing things of recent times, or going back over the past decade or so, has been on the shipbuilding here in Cairns, and some decisions in Brisbane that absolutely shocked me. We built the patrol boats back in the 1980s, late 70s, 1980s, basically with a state government guarantee of because the Navy requires a whole lot of guarantees, and when they hand out a major contract like that, we secured it, but it was with the state government backing because NQEA had difficulty meeting those guarantee requirements. But when it came up to the air warfare destroyers, Brisbane refused. And we virtually had the contract and we lost it because there wasn't that guarantee out of the state government. And of course, we've been competing here with our shipbuilding against Western Australia and South Australia and Victoria and so forth, that have put a lot of money, a lot of state money into building up the capacity in those industries. But the whole marine sector here is very important to the economy. It's one of the areas that we have developed in manufacturing, like the aviation sector, that we've developed a manufacturing servicing capability that leads the north. And but we do need, a strong government backing on some of these things.
Mm. The absolute circular nature of the discussion we're having, would strike anyone listening to this. So our listeners don't think it's just a complete love-in and a rubber stamp. I'm sure there would be some challenges. Would you be happy to outline some of the challenges and some of the issues that a new state organisation and the formation of a new state would have to be aware of?
Yeah, well, eventually, of course, it will depend on public opinion and the public, wanting. And I've seen some research recently where, in fact, the indications are that people's hearts are in a new state, and I think it's there, but of course a lot of people are worried about viability. They're worried about boundaries and things like that. And of course, a number of things, these things are going to have to be addressed and resolved. But basically, what we're doing with a new state, say from Rockhampton or Gladstone North, is that traditionally we've had 4 strong regions. They're each independent and at times competing. And of course, it's understandable that realities of areas and distance lead to this, because when you look across the north, it's 40% of the continent. And really what you've got across the north, you've got 6 states south of the tropic. But north of the tropic, you've got 6 major regions, and 4 in Queensland and the Northern Territory and across the northwest of Western Australia. And one of the issues, of course, in pulling together a new state in the north, of course, is to pull those 4 regions together and solve the issues of how it is going to operate. Now, already, of course, Australia's faced that with the Commonwealth, and where the 6 states were drawn together into a Commonwealth, into a federation. And one of the things, of course, we've got to address is pulling those 4 regions in the north into a united regions of the northeast. Of course, one of the common factors for us all is the Great Barrier Reef, and I think that's something we all share, but we all share, of course, the similarity of climate, and so there are some issues there that obviously need to be addressed, and of course with those things, of course, the public will come along once that it is seen to be viable. And of course, there's a whole lot of questions of working out in detail, just what the finances would be. And obviously a major factor in it all is that the Commonwealth funding into the states is really dependent upon the delivery of services. The Northern Territory, If you take New South Wales, for instance, it's cheaper to deliver government services in Sydney, a big dense population. But of course, in working out the factors, rural New South Wales would attract more money than Sydney in the formula. It comes out that New South Wales comes below the average. And similarly, Victoria, Queensland comes in just above the average, but southern Queensland would come in below the average. The northern Queensland area would come in above, like the Northern Territory and Tasmania and South Australia. So we could, under the current Grants Commission arrangements, we would come in quite strongly there. But of course, then, however, offsetting that, we've got the very strong mining royalties that are counted into the factor. But between all those factors, we should come in with very substantial Commonwealth funding as per other states. And you know, that's an important thing to work through to demonstrate that you know, what the financial situation would be.
Yeah, and that's it. Because when I'm kind of talking to people, a lot of them say, well, you know, well, Matt, it kind of gets circular. You're pro a new state, therefore you don't see the challenges. You're only seeing the positive sides of things. And one of the big points that I wanted to make in this interview is that Boot Brisbane, Northern Vibe, and anyone else involved in this magnificent project are not blind to the fact that there are some issues around it, and that you know, we're talking to people, and we are kind of aware of it. Look, Bill, we're coming up to the hour, but with your permission, I'd like to keep going for a little while, because we can do a little bit of editing. Do you have the inclination to continue?
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, look, that being the case, and there's even some, because this has been a really interesting conversation, and it's raised a number of questions in my mind that are incidental to the new state that I kind of want to cover off as well. But I know you did discuss a lot of the history of kind of what's happening in Cairns. But can you give us a bit of an ebb and flow of the specific economic fortunes of Cairns in far north Queensland, particularly in the periods of the, if I can use the phrase, the Biocumander, and since the reinstatement of the current one vote, one value system in '89? Can you discuss that?
Yeah, well, of course, the situation changed actually on the political front with the Labor Party. We have had two treasurers during that period over the past 30 years, and that was Keith DeLacy. And standing behind Keith, of course, was that brilliant Treasury Secretary, or head of the Treasury, Leo Hilcher, who was there with the Bjelke-Petersen regime and guided the states very well. And of course, that influence continued through into the 1990s. And more recently, of course, we've had Curtis Pitt, who, however, he was replaced as treasurer, which was a little bit disappointing for the North. But on the coalition side, there's been of course, politically, the old coalition between the National Party and the Liberal Party continued, but it was uncomfortable. And the National Party, there was always a struggle there between the Liberal Party and the National Party about being the senior partner. Now, when Beattie brought in optional preferential, of course, it virtually forced an amalgamation of the two. But I don't think that the LNP has been, well, you can see it in the representation in the seats at present. There's not a great deal of representation of the LNP in the North at present, and a lot of that will be due to perceptions of performance, etc. However,
Yep.
As far as the Cairns region goes, we did really well up until during the 80s and the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, through to about 1998 when the Asian crisis hit us. One of the things about the Cairns region is that, particularly because of tourism, but also some of the other sectors, it's very much exposed to international markets, to the global economy. And so we tend to be hit more heavily when there are those changes, and we're seeing one of those big hits at present with the international tourism market cut off. And so it's been a bit more susceptible, but then we bounced back after we lost a fair bit of ground there for a couple of years with the Asian financial crisis, but we bounced back relatively quickly, although in that period there was SARS that delayed that, there was the Gulf War that delayed that, and then there was 9/11 that delayed that. But we did bounce back, but then we went through a period, and this was happening in the mid-90s. The Australian dollar was going up through the roof, and it was partly not just because of commodity prices, it was because the Reserve Bank was putting up interest rates to try and curb the economy. But one of the side effects of higher interest rates in Australia is that we become very attractive to money floating around the world. And when that money comes floating in chasing those higher interest rates, it puts the dollar up. And so that particularly affected the Cairns region. There was a drop in the dollar there straight after the global financial crisis. Actually, we lost the Japanese market before the global financial crisis because of and a lot of it was because of the high dollar affecting competitiveness. And then the high dollar affected us after with the mining boom, but of course it's come back down. But then the whole world, our growth in more recent years has been quite poor compared to the last 3, 4, 5 years. We've been right down at about 1%, whereas our long-term average for Cairns as a city is about 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, depends on the period that you look at. So we have been going through a lesser growth period. Of course, the end of the mining boom saw Townsville's growth very, very strongly cut back. Mackay actually go backwards for a while, and Rocky, and Darwin is going through a bad period after the being pumped up with the big gas project up there.
Yeah, look, that's you've actually knocked over one of the questions that I was going to ask you, so that's kind of good. But is the Cairns economy, do we have enough diversity in the Cairns economy, well, right now and right before kind of COVID?
Yeah, actually, we do have more. I did an exercise recently. I was asked to have a look at the drivers of Cairns economic growth over a long period, and it took me right back into the late 1800s. However, what's happened over the years is that we had that strong growth period, and mining has come through, agriculture has come through, but then the real star performer was tourism. And so we did, in fact, have a Cairns development, although tourism sort of was the big growth factor there. Some of these other sectors were also growing. And another thing in more recent decades has been that coming through of things like the marine sector and the aviation servicing sector, that giving Cairns a more diverse economy. But of course, as I outlined earlier, that marine sector got badly knocked about with the failures over the shipbuilding, and so we've had a much more diverse economy than a lot of people believe. However, over the last, I did an exercise from 2005-06 through to the most recent figures, and when you took out inflation, tourism had only increased by about 9% over a 16-year period or 15-year period. And however, mining had increased by over 100%, and agriculture, I think it was up around 40%. Now, this is taking the value of them, but taking inflation out. This is real, real growth. So what's been happening more recently is that we had become accustomed to that tourism sector growing extremely rapidly and strongly. Now, that hasn't happened over and obviously we need to continue building up other industries. The economy of this region is not, I shudder when people talk about Cairns as the tourist town, because its fundamental role is that of a regional servicing capital, a distribution, a transport hub, a distribution hub, a manufacturing hub, administrative hub, professional services, and all that sort of thing. So it's very, very much linked in with that regional economy. Now, tourism is terribly important in it, but the other sectors are very important in it. And to get those other sectors growing, however, we need to look at very fundamental things like there's opportunities there, and there has been in agriculture, but that requires it to look at dams, the Coranda Range Road. It requires it to look at ports and so forth to get commodities out as opposed to people. And the other thing that is come through in more recent times is that when I go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, or you go back to the 50s, Cairns was half the size of Townsville, and the regional population was smaller. But now it's come through that the Cairns and the Cairns region is now the largest in population in Northern Australia. It's always been larger than the Northern Territory, but it's come through. And so there are opportunities there. A lot of the development of Cairns as a regional city has not occurred. For instance, in higher education, we've got about half the number of people employed per head of population in university level as the other cities of our size in Australia. And obviously, there's a big push on at present to upgrade the hospital. And of course, the Cairns Hospital District is now the biggest in terms of patient demand in Queensland outside of the southeast corner. So there's opportunities there to be followed through. Yeah, we must continue to build the economy. You mentioned Winton. One of the problems in that area is that because of those centralising factors, and they affect this region, we've been able to keep ahead of them because we've grown our earnings from the rest of the world. But out in that country, of course, they've got very strong growth to start with the wool industry, but it has tended to stagnate. And of course, all those centralising tendencies, if you don't keep moving ahead, and particularly earning income from the rest of the world, you'll tend to go backwards. And of course, we've been facing some fairly severe centralising effects coming in, and it's not just transport, it's communications. And of course, some of those factors have been with the advent of computers and the internet and all that sort of thing, how it's changing the structure of employment and so forth at times in favour of the major cities. Certainly within the region, if you look at those type of factors, lead to the regional city, Cairns growing faster than the rest of the region. One of the important things in this region as the rights progressed is that our hinterland has grown, partly because of agriculture and mining and to a degree tourism. It's grown much faster. Our hinterland's grown faster than most other regions around Australia.
Wow, that's that's kind of really interesting, and it also indicates too that when you're speaking about the independence of the regions there, Cairns and Townsville, we're going to have to learn to get on, really, aren't we? As much as we.
Yes, well, that's what I said. This is one of the great challenges: is to form a common view across those four regions, and so that we do get policies that are more suited to us, because there's a lot of similarities in the economies. We've all got elements in it of. We've all got elements of tourism. Cairns is real big in it. We've got elements of fisheries. We've all got elements of mining, with some of the regions very, very strong in that area. We've all got interests in agriculture and pastoral industries, and so with a new state. We have got a common interest in the having very similar basic structures, and also the ways forward for us. And what we need is policies that are really attuned to what we need.
Exactly. And look, I'm sure that if push comes to shove, I'm sure that Townsville and I will learn to kiss and make up. We can both kind of swallow our pride and force ourselves to do that. I only have one more new state relevant question, and then, if it's okay, we'll just cover off on a couple of other things. You were talking before about some of the failures in regards to the maritime industry and how they were political decisions that really, really failed Cairns as a far northern region. Mate, would you mind discussing some of the best economic outcomes for regions and some of the worst economic outcomes for the regions that have flowed on from decisions made in Brisbane, from specifically Brisbane-centric policy decisions?
Well, one of the most important things in the north, going back in time, that allowed our horticultural sector to get up was just the sealing of the Bruce Highway and the upgrading of the Bruce Highway. Now, of course, that was terribly important at the time. The other thing that was terribly important going back was the decision to upgrade the airport, but that was mainly with Canberra. And in fact, we got it a little bit in some of the people in Brisbane were pushing for Townsville, but fortunately we had at the time a minister in the federal cabinet in the form of David Thompson, and we got the airport upgrading through. Of course, Cairns was already an international airport with a traffic to and from Papua New Guinea. So there's been, of course, we got a decision to establish the university campus. However, it's always been as a sub-campus, and we've never sort of gone through to having a standalone campus in the area. Yeah, there's been a number of decisions obviously there that benefit the north. However, as I have pointed out in more recent times, there's been a failure in terms of per capita capital expenditure compared to other areas of the state. Not so much Brisbane, but other areas of the state. But on the negative side, of course, there's been a number of things that come through. More recently, I mentioned the shipbuilding. I mentioned one of the things that was the whole Reef 2050 plan. Okay, it all sounds very good about protecting the Great Barrier Reef and so forth, but basically what it's done is, as part of that plan, no new ports. Now, we've got people who want to ship silica, open another silica mine up north of Cooktown, but they're being very severely affected by that policy. And of course, there's no way in the world it's going to affect the Great Barrier Reef, but also it meant that with the dredging of the channel in Cairns, the science was pointing to that we could replace the or place the spoil at sea without affecting the reef. However, the requirement that it come on shore has meant that the original plan would have enabled us to take out 4 million cubic metres for about 120 million. We've just spent, because it's had to come on shore, we've just spent 120 million to take out less than 1 million cubic metres. And it means that we still can't get the Voyager class ships in, and you know, potential effects there on other bulk shipping. So there's that. There's been delay with the Commander Range Road. Of course, there's been no definite forward. The benefit cost analysis of Nalinga was very, very poor, technically poor. That came in very negative. And when you compare it with other benefit cost analyses, if you applied what was applied to Nalinga, virtually no dam would stand up in viability. And then there's been all the business of tree clearing, and with the expansion of agriculture, people out in the Gulf and up the peninsula, wanting to expand agriculture, willing to invest in it, but being held up by things like allocations of water and tree clearing, etc.
Yeah.
Look, I could go on. There's probably more there that I've missed.
Look, precisely. I had this I had this fantastic conversation with John McCall and Jason Costigan, and something I suspect part of it was me. I didn't articulate it perhaps as well as I could have, but I kept on talking about the 73 in the southeast corner, and he misunderstood it, I think, because to give it, to give him credit, we were having a conversation in around how we can get the new state above the line. But to me, the other issue was that we do have this critical mass of electorates in the southeast corner, and they make Brisbane-centric decisions. So any of the sorts of stuff that you're talking about there, it's got to fly down to Brisbane. And the former speaker was like, well, not really. You've got to get this minority from this amount of people. You've got to speak to this amount of people. And I'm like, so what you're kind of not getting is that there is a culture of people who live in southeast corner. They're an urbane culture. The somewheres and anywheres arguments. The bush versus the city. These dynamics are well known to people, and they're real. And that's the big dynamic that we just are really never going to get over when we only have, say, 20 electorates.
Yes.
All of regional Queensland.
The reality is that the North really is at a different stage of development to Southern Australia. It's in a catch-up phase. And a lot of the policies that we need probably policies that were popular in New South Wales and Victoria and the South, some of it 100 years ago, going back in time. And we do need different, we've always needed different approaches, because there's been that lag in development in tropical Australia. That's never been fully recognised, that there's a dynamic in there. So, we're in a phase of agricultural expansion that was gone through, back in time. And
that's it. They kind of take it for granted. Because, things are fine if you're living in the southeast corner. By magic, your food appears, stuff flies in. You pick up the phone, you can call a police officer. They're going to be there within, 15 to 20 minutes.
Yes.
Whatever, then you can name whatever it is service that you like when it comes to that. If you need a decision made, you can go to your local MP, and it probably actually matters because you are part of that critical mass. There are all these dynamics that impact on these really, these things that the Southerners just shake their heads and go, well, no, we've had enough development now. We don't need to develop anymore. What we've got to do is preserve. Like, they're in the preservation stage. I totally get where they're coming from that. Well, it's more accurate, as you've articulated. No. You're in the preservation stage, and you need your part of the state that you've got to look at and go, well, what am I going to lock up? as a national park? What are we going to put in an area that's a park that you can log bits of? What are we going to, what are we going to give to Indigenous people? What are we going to do for them? All of those decisions those guys can make. But what we kind of really want is them to get off our backs, get out of our pockets, and let us make decisions for ourselves. Because this weird condescension that, well, you rednecks in the north, you're just going to destroy everything. You kind of need the civilizing hand of the southeast corner to stop you from chopping down everything, digging everything up, disempowering Indigenous people and destroying their lives and locking them all up. And it's like, no, you've articulated it so well. They're at a different stage of development. And that's, I'm going to steal that phrase, Bill, be warned. I'm stealing that, and it's going to be in part of our stuff. Well, look, we'll wrap it up on that. This has gone for an hour and 21. This is the longest interview I've done, and really, really enjoyed the chat. Thank you very much for taking time out of your very, very busy schedule to kind of talk to me today. We will be definitely putting this up on all of our websites, and I think we're going to be chopping it up a bit too, because there's some little golden nuggets there, so some specific issues that we really need to put into the shorter videos. But look, again, thanks very much. Interesting, informative, and God willing, we'll get you back on Northern Vibe again sometime in the future.
It's a pleasure, Matt. And all my best wishes for your aspirations.
Thank you.